Thank you. I think in the curriculum, it really depends on your university, but we have to see that universities have different roles. We have the educational role, and that can be split into incorporating the educating an individual and also a societal role. So by educating an individual and improving someone's skills, but also trying to improve, sort of have better human capital and develop societies as well. And the research function is not just about knowledge production, but it has to be also about knowledge transfer. And to me, one of the key aspects of universities in sustainability is to look with, in terms of research, is to work with the key stakeholders at all sorts of different levels. And that's not just at regional levels. So for the majority of research often is about regional participation with local stakeholders, businesses, charities, but we must look at the international level and working with international partners as well. And the most successful projects, the most successful research will work with those international partners from the start of those projects. So work with those stakeholders to co-develop those research projects and to involve the local stakeholders on the ground. So for example, I'm working on my expertise is in environmental pollution. And with environmental pollution in Ukraine, we will work with farmers because they understand the pollution on their farmland and the damage that that does. But we'll also work with them to try and find solutions. So, for example, looking at remediation technology that farmers can implement because they know what infrastructure they have on their farms and what's going to work in real life. So it's not just about finding solutions from as scientists, but it's working with locals in those areas to understand what's going to work sustainably, what's going to be cost effective, and what's going to fit with, for example, policies in certain countries as well in terms of subsidies and so on. So it's really for us is trying to encourage as much as possible collaboration and less where academics often want to work in their own silos and keep their own research. We have to work with people and understand what knowledge we already have and what the gaps are in our understanding about sustainability issues.
Thank you very much. We would come back to you in a couple of minutes while we give the key takeaway for today's discussion. And we're coming back to our on-site audience. And this is a very important part in this academic conversation because we have the representative of the student society, and it's the student of London School of Economics, Marina Cymbaluk, and the representative of Roзвitku Youth Climate Initiative. And as we started in Ukraine's pavilion, and we continue being in Ukraine's pavilion, let's zoom in our international experience and international expertise to what is currently going on in Ukraine. And can you please share from your take on what is the current state of the research capacity in Ukrainian universities, and do they have adequate resources such as research centers, laboratories, equipment, and dedicated spaces to support the sustainable development, and to what extent they are ready to contribute to the green recovery and reconstruction that we have been talking so much in this pavilion for the previous week?
Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to deliver my speech alongside such renowned academic representatives and professionals. So thank you once again. I'd like to focus on factors that, as a rule, hinder the green transformation through research. And in my opinion, they should be addressed first if we want sustainable progress. So three main challenges are as follows. The first one is the lack of university research institutions per se and the underfunding. The second one is the lack of specialized intersectional programs in universities. And the third one is low climate awareness among students and faculty. So talking about research institutions, when we think of Western universities, we picture this robust partnership with research institutions and research and development sector, fueled by funding from alumni, businesses, and philanthropists. Top institutions like MIT, Harvard, Stanford, and many European universities lead the way, yet no Ukrainian university is among these top 250 best universities in research. And in Ukraine, universities and research institutes are mostly separate. That's like the overall situation, which limits students' chances to engage in research. Few collaboration opportunities and internship proposals are promoted, so students actually miss out on connecting with the valuable experience Ukrainian academia has. And talking about lack of intersectional programs, let me here get straight to the point, take into account, for instance, Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, one of our top universities, and it offers only one intersectional master's in ecology and environmental protection, which, I stress, received no applications in 2024. Why? The program is purely theoretical. As I found out, it lacks practical applications, and it reflects an outdated view that ecology isn't vital, isn't profitable, and it has no connections to law, economics, international relations, which is not true. But we all have these views, and when talking to my peers and saying that I'm going to apply to LSE and study environmental policy and regulation, they were like, it's just like an ecology. It's just ecology. It's just natural science. Like you studied international economic relations, and now you want to do ecology. Like they couldn't bridge the gaps. They couldn't understand what I'm talking about policy. Like what? Environmental policy? Okay. So yeah, at my alma mater, the Institute of International Relations, there is also only one master's program in environmental and energy security in international relations. And it's so under-promoted that I only discovered it while preparing for this panel. Like the administration of the university didn't say a word about this program. I didn't know it existed. So like, it's a shame. And while doing my bachelor's thesis on EU climate change institutionalization, I relied solely on open sources because we didn't even have the access to academic research bases like ResearcherGate. Like I couldn't afford to pay $40 or $30 for one article. So you can imagine the level, like the quality of our thesis when we only have like open access to just like maybe 5% of all of the papers and books that exist. So it's also like quite a setback. And by contrast, at LSE, and I'm sure in other US, UK, and EU greatest universities, I'm studying environmental policy and regulations, but students have usually access to different kinds of these intersectional programs. At LSE, there are 12 of them. They're related to environmental studies and cover different aspects of climate policy, economics of climate change, health, urban planning. All of these we don't have. And also the level of specialization, this level of specialization, the UK and like other Western universities provide, it helps students approach topics critically, analyze things critically, and identify gaps in research they would like to research further. And Ukrainian state universities lack this interdisciplinary approach and leaving students without the depth necessary to drive sustainable change. And the third factor, climate change awareness. It's my personal story. Yeah, it's really emotional for me to talk about it, but in one of my economics lectures, a professor dismissed climate change as a conspiracy. And my course mates, of course, listened closely to this, to his opinion, while my arguments, backed by data, backed by researches, backed by infographics, were just ignored. And it didn't matter how loud I talked about this, because there he was, a renowned professor with years of experience. So of course, there was some trust from students to the professor, not to me, 20-year-old girl. So, and another professor also claimed that humans only contribute 3% to climate change, citing a questionable source I could never locate, actually. But she did that, like the word spread. And I'm sure that so many of our students who listened to these statistics already used it where it was convenient. So like, it was just really emotional to hear that. And I just couldn't forgive myself for not telling you this story, just for you to understand what kind of situation we have in top universities of Ukraine. I'm not saying that all professors share these views. No, absolutely not. But these experiences reveal a significant gap in climate awareness and understanding among educators. So I believe we need an environmental awareness campaign led by the Ministry of Environmental Protection and the Ministry of Education and Science, with support, of course, from our international university partners and research centers. This would help develop updated curricula for our students that treat ecology as an integrated field linked with economics, law, international relations, not isolated from them. So our professors also need a solid grounding in environmental topics to pass the knowledge to students, and only then starting from this top-down approach, from the ministries to the universities, from the universities to the professors, and only from the professors to students can we develop bottom-up movement where students become motivated and interested in doing something for their society, for their country. They know the gaps they want to fill, and they actually start doing something, they contribute. So yeah, engaging in climate action through research is crucial for Ukrainian youth, but we must address these key issues first. And this September, our Youth Climate Initiative, Roзвitk, submitted a statement to the Ministry of Environmental Protection on nationally determined contributions. And one of the three main demands was to create these intersectional specialized programs in our universities to help young people gain green policy qualifications. So to sum up, please, let's work together to bring a stronger foundation where climate action through research can finally become a reality for our young people. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your experience. And I think, do we have such a great representatives of Ukrainian youth? I'm not worried about the sustainable and green future of Ukraine. So thanks a lot. And just wrap it all up, I would ask every single panelist to give your possibly key takeaway or your tip of advice to how to use the lessons from academia, from research, from your personal experience in communicating the evidence-based research to policymakers. How we can, again, coming back to the framing, bridge the gap, because academics are usually talking in their own bubble. Policymakers are talking usually in their own bubble. Then we have the representatives of the youth that usually are following more of the influencers these days, rather than knowing if they're not properly educated, who they should listen to. Again, like very great reference to only open access and not an ability, like the lack of the opportunity to accept the best knowledge from the leading universities in such countries like Ukraine. But Ukraine is just, again, here is a case study. So your key takeaway, how we can be sure that policymakers are listening to scholars, are listening to academia, and academia is really driving forward, and the research and international cooperation really driving forward the climate action. So possibly we can start with Alex.
Well, thank you for the wonderfully detailed question. And honestly, unbelievably important question, because what's happening right now, particularly in the United States, is the science is getting conflated with disinformation. And the credibility of the universities is being replaced by think tanks that are not based in the science. So, for instance, there's a town in the upper Midwest of the United States, and there's this club you can join. But in order to join this club, you have to convince a certain percentage of the population of some false fact or rumor. And then you can sit at the table with the crew in the small town. And so a gentleman wanted to join this club. So he made a fact up that said, you know, the wind turbines they just put there, the government is using them to blow the clouds and wind depending on where they want the rain to go. And to his delight and horror, a good chunk of the population started to believe it. And he started as a joke to get into this club, and then it spread and spread, and then other disinformation apparatuses started taking it over, and it has spread well beyond the Midwest in the United States. So that's one small example of how this is actually being weaponized against good policy. And organized too. So if you look at offshore wind in the United States, the conservative think tanks who are taking pseudoscience and saying, here's, trust us on these facts and figures and so forth that are not based in reality, they raised $72 million, and they put about 20 million of that into about 18 organizations along the East Coast. And the goal of that was to say offshore wind is going to kill whales and going to harm the environment. The science shows that's absolutely the opposite, right? In fact, offshore wind is going to save whales' lives by preventing the destruction of our oceans and acidification and their habitat and their food, right? Because we're reducing the effect of climate change. That's what the science shows. But when we went around to the other lawmakers in the Northeast, they all were thinking what the disinformation had told them. So this is why it's so unbelievably important that the scientific institutions pair with the elected officials to work on these issues to get the knowledge out there. And that's why working with the University of San Francisco and elected officials to protect America and elected officials to protect the earth on the international side, we're very committed to making sure that the lawmakers get to experience and talk with the academics about what is the real science and how they can use that to inform their policy and say, no, actually, this is the reality, and then tell their friends. Because not everyone's going to get the chance to come to the University of San Francisco, I think in your district, but they will get the chance to chat with their friends, and lawmakers like to talk. So we'll talk to each other and share the stories. So.
Well, I think that as we heard from everybody on this panel, we all need each other. We need each other to be able to possibly accomplish the goals that we've set out on climate change and on a whole range of other issues. But I think forming those partnerships and those relationships and integrating the work of government and politicians with academic institutions and reputable research institutions is the best way to do it. And it doesn't need to be because it sounds good or feels good or whatever else, or it's in theory a good thing. The way to do it the right way and sustainable way is actually find out how it helps to accomplish goals that each of us respectively have. For example, if you have a research institution or academic institution, their partnership with a government or a set of politicians can also provide access for researchers, provide access for students to be able to work on these issues directly, faculty to be able to work on these issues, which helps with their research, and vice versa. If you have a government that has passed a policy or set a goal, we might not have the research capacity internally to be able to develop these policies or to implement them. So a partnership with an academic institution opens up a possibility that then not only makes it so that we do it the right way, but also makes us look good, helps politicians do things that they feel are good for their constituents. So I think these kind of integration of these institutions and policymakers and government agencies together in a way that actually accomplishes a goal. So it's not a one way. I'm not going to an academic institution saying, you know, do this for us and you get nothing out of it. They should get something out of it as well. And I think that's how you make it really sustainable for the long term, and also make sure that it's actually having an impact in the real world.
Yeah. So we all apparently agree that politics have to be science-based and that we have to closely cooperate. And now we are at a watershed in a way. On the one side, I see the tendency, many climate laws, for example, implemented scientific councils, and it works that science directly goes into politics. And at least in my experience in the EU, in Germany, politics come to science and ask for advice, say, how can we do that? And they really listen and integrate that. You can see this process. But on the other side, you have this populist movement. I don't mention your country now. And you have this tendency, what we mentioned, disinformation, work against this. And apparently this gets stronger and stronger. I mentioned the EU. Yeah, we have good examples, but we have also Orban as the worst at the moment, but we have Meloni. We have in France the populists getting up. In Germany, we have now two populist parties who are really going the way of anti-science with disinformation. So I wanted just to shed a little salt into our things. And what can we do? Keep on researching, keep on teaching. It's nothing else left than following the track. And I have to admit, so I had a huge change in my career. I started very much as an inhabitant of the ivory tower, saying pure science, you know, I publish it, and who wants to listen and read can listen. And I went more and more to keeping some theory and very fundamental science, but also going towards really applied science, which in my former life I didn't even recognize as science. You know, this is that also science has to do steps toward politics to make science digestible for and applicable. This is so my lesson. Keep on researching, and in this way, don't stay in your ivory tower, but get practical also as a professor.
Yeah, talking about the government listening to young researchers, especially like young students. On the one hand, the work is already being done. For instance, the creation of Youth Council was of much help, but still the functions and the responsibilities of these youth councils are to be determined. They are vague, and sometimes we see these youth councils as tokenization of youth. Like they exist, but we are not listened to if we look deeper. So I'd like to stress this important process as involving youth like 100%, not just creating an illusion that it exists and that's it, because we have ideas, we have knowledge, we are becoming experts year by year, and we want to be listened to. We have something to share with governments. So that's step number one. And for instance, I really hope that during next COP, COP30, there will be at least one official youth delegate, because it's still a problem. We are hoping we will get it. We will get what we want. So yeah, step number 1, and after that, full cooperation.
All right. A lot has been said, and I would echo many things that were already mentioned. One thing I think as a researcher one really has to come to accept is policymakers do not read papers, and certainly do not read books. They just don't have time for that. And even MIT professors often don't realize when, as an academic, I think one really has to learn to use the very same tools that those organizations that so effectively broadcast messages and disinformation are using, with targeted marketing, with targeted, formats, the language that reaches the audiences they want to reach. We need to institutionalize that at universities. MIT, as I said, is not, even MIT is not very strong at that. They just launched now a climate policy center to sort of translate MIT's research in the right format, in the right size and length and all that to the policymakers. As researchers, we have to get out of our comfort zones. We like to sit behind desks and sort of, write things and then hope, as Michael was saying, that the truth will find its way to the audience. No, we have to go out. We have to engage personally. So I think the interaction, the human interaction, nothing can beat that. I fear that we also need to put pressure on policymakers, because I do not see this dilemma of disinformation being solved from the bottom up alone. I think we need top-down approaches as well, and this is fiendishly difficult. But I think the mini elections around the world, but especially the one just a week and a half ago in the United States, showed us, many said democracy is starting to show it doesn't work. That's not true. The democratic process worked fine. The election, it was a robust election. The quality of the outcomes, however, depends on the quality of the information on which the voters base their choices. And that's where we see the breakdown. And so at some point, I think we also need to tackle through policy how voters get information and how we sort of, and it's very, very difficult. I don't have good answers for that. So, but those would be kind of 3 different things, some of which we can do as researchers, some of which we can only pressure policy to tackle going forward.
Thank you very much. I don't know if we have our online participants still there on and something to share. Yes, we do. And would you like to share some final key takeaways? Because you have been like a silent observer directly from the UK. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think I will echo what a couple of other people have said. You mentioned evidence-based research, and we've talked about research in the format that is going to be useful for policymakers. And I think that's really important. In terms of evidence-based research on environmental issues, there are some issues that we do have a huge amount of evidence that we need to continue to gather more data on. There are some issues that we have far less data. And if you take the example of environmental pollution, some aspects of environmental pollution we know a huge amount about. If you take environmental pollution from warfare as an example, we know very little. And so we can't make policy decisions without enough data to understand what's really happening. We don't have enough data in that sort of environmental pollution from warfare, for example. We don't have enough samples collected. We don't have enough controls. The methods differ so much. Mostly it's from shooting ranges and not real sites, that kind of thing. And it's not only about having enough data, but it's how we get that. And the only way that we can get really good, robust data is by collaborating, by pooling together our individual expertise and our resources rather than working in silos. And just to give an example of that, with environmental pollution, I was looking at samples where we'd taken soil samples in Ukraine and we were trying to match up the intensity of conflict with the level of contamination. And I couldn't see any link between the conflict intensity I'd got from open source data. My colleague in Ukraine, because she was on the ground, could give me a real idea of what the conflict intensity was in those areas, and the data completely changed then. I knew where in reality was a hotspot of contamination and of conflict. And so having someone on the ground that has real knowledge of a site is so useful, and you can otherwise get this kind of the disinformation, right? A completely different story if you don't have that. And finally, it would just be that we are universities are educational institutions, and to get students who are really passionate about these issues and who are really knowledgeable, it is not just a case of giving students lectures, but it is about involving students in all stages of university, from the first year they join all the way through in our research. Because often they're the students that have the great ideas that we haven't thought of as well. So that's my points really are, make sure there's the evidence, make sure it's in that format that policymakers can use, and involve colleagues from different countries and involve students in that research as well.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much. Our grades, I think like this is the highest concentration of IQ for 1 square meter. And I'm really thankful for you for allocating your time and talking about such an important topic. And does anybody from the audience would like to ask any question? Okay. Yes, please.
Okay. Yeah, there was a very good solution proposed, an idea to introduce intersectional courses in Ukraine. Maybe there are like such existing already in US and and European universities. Are there formats of collaboration between universities that could be used to transfer the programs or their adaptation for Ukrainian students?
Yeah, of course. So I talked about it actually. We have really great intersectional specialized programs both in the US, in the UK. I mentioned also my LSE programs. They are focused on different sectors, not just on environment, but on climate economics, health, urban planning, development, local development as well. So of course, when working together with the Ministry of Environmental Protection and Ministry of Education and Science, we need to engage with international partners and of course universities, which can give us this insight on how they created these programs, what programs work the best, like what are the insights on that. And only after that, I think we could like adapt what we have abroad to the context, to the Ukrainian context, and of course to take into consideration the war context, because it's much work to understand how to rebuild Ukraine after the war, not just to make the country sustainable. So of course we have to adjust it, and we need our partners and Ukrainian academia as well. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Thank you very much for this really interesting panel. I have one question regarding fake news that you've been talking about, because I really fear that we don't reach the people anymore, that even if we come out of our ivory tower and we engage with policymakers, I fear that everybody stays in their own bubble. How do we pop those bubbles? How do we reach those people? Because I think if they don't want to listen to us anymore, how can we break this barrier?
So one of the best ways to break the bubbles is actually by bringing folks together, right? So for instance, that's why we, at the Certificate in Public Leadership, we bring folks together for a weekend in Washington, D.C. So they get to see each other as humans, they get to know each other, and they get really wonderful policy discussions, and then they educate each other. Because there's no way we can provide the same amount of education as everyone in that room, between their breadth of experience as policymakers, as funders, as philanthropists, as folks on the ground making the solutions happen right now. But what we can provide is the structure in which they can collaborate. And so we need more of that within but the policy arenas to the academic arenas so that we actually bring everyone together. And my alarm wants me to wake up to come here on the East Coast. But really, the value of that we've seen is because we get good policy out of it, and that's how we know it's working. The other part of it is we tend to message incorrectly when we work on this. We tend to say, here are the 3 points we got out of it, rule of 3, now here are the facts. Because the wonderful thing about being and working on environmental issues, we have amazing facts behind us. But humans are not fact-based. We don't make decisions based on facts. If it was, we have very different politicians, right? We make decisions based on emotions. And how to educate and communicate that way is not what we're taught in our education systems. We're actually taught in the education systems to learn something and regurgitate the facts. We're not taught to figure that to be able to listen, right? Because listening creates persuasion. There are plenty of studies on that. And then how to connect on an emotional level before we dive into the facts and figures, which are so vitally important. So connecting on the shared values first, and then through a story, because stories imprint themselves on our brains faster than facts and figures, and they last longer. So really, it's about bringing people together, then telling the stories of how this happened, so we remember it through shared values, and then from there, say, here are the facts that back it up, give it the credibility and the advice for moving forward and collaborating on wonderful policy.
Thank you very much. I think we have to be mindful of time, and we have already taken so much of your expertise here, and lots of further thoughts and thought-provoking conversations should be taking place and will be taking place in this pavilion after this panel discussion. So thank you very much. So round of applause for our panelists, and thank you for being here for us, being here for Ukraine, and being such a great examples that would be leading the sustainable world and sustainable future for Ukraine and the whole world. Thanks.